In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Kartra native column support, and then I'm going to demonstrate what the KCSG Tools for Kartra column power tool adds to the mix. So first of all, to insert a column in Kartra, you have to have like a donor column, a place to drag and drop an existing column from. So you can either drag an empty row with an empty column in it, or you can clone an existing row and take a column from that. And then you come over to the column controls, and then you can drag and drop that column after any existing column. The native Kartra controls don't currently let you insert in front of the first column, but you can insert, or actually I should say append, after any of the existing columns. So I'll drop that column from the previous row right here. And so if you wanted the new column to be the first column, then you can drag the original first column to be after the inserted column. So now the inserted column is now first. So that demonstrates reordering, and if I take this back out, I can click on the delete column and it will delete my column. You can use the edit column width function to resize. So you bring that up and it shows the width of each column. You can move columns around, like just by dragging this bar where you want the column to be. And you can resize by grabbing these little blue bars on the end. They don't move continuously, they move in discrete steps. So as I first start to move this, it doesn't look like anything's happening. But when I get to the next increment of column width, then you'll see it snap to the next size. So it moves in these column width increments. So I'm just going to move these over here for later. And those are the basic functions: insert, reordering, deleting, and resizing in the Kartra native column support. So what the KCSG Tools for Kartra column power tool adds is the ability to insert empty columns anywhere without the donor rows. So I don't have to bring in an empty row component or clone a row to get a donor row with a donor column to drag in. I can just drag in an empty column, and I'll show that in a minute. It has a display that shows the page builder edit window width, and that's just the width of this editing canvas from side to side here, in case you want to know what that would look like as a standalone screen or window. It will show you what that width is as you choose between the desktop, tablet, and mobile views, or as you resize the window. And the main purpose for the column power tool's existence is for advanced layout design, and I'll show that as we get into the tour. So the first part here is getting into the column power tool. Go to the row level tools. These are the column level tools. These are the row level tools. When you have KCSG Tools for Kartra installed, the Chrome plugin, and when you have the column tool enabled in the options, you will have a new icon here at the end of the row level settings that says Open Column Tool. Click that and the column power tool will open up. It's a semi-transparent panel. As you can see, you can drag it around. It works slightly differently than the native controls where you drag the actual columns. You have these little proxy column controls labeled A through L for up to 12 different columns. And since you're dragging the proxy around to add a reorder instead of the actual column, when you hover over the proxy column, it will blink the column that corresponds to the proxy column that you're hovering over. And that works both for these controls up here for the add reorder section and for the sizing controls that are down here. So I can demonstrate the inserting a column. We can insert, sometimes you have to jiggle a little bit to get it to go in the right place. You can insert before the first column or after the last column, it doesn't matter. So as I drop this here, you can see it's added a new column at the beginning. One of the things, especially if you have a lot of columns, you want to identify where you want to do your insertion or reordering before you start to do the reordering. Especially if you have a lot of rows, when you're dragging a column around, it doesn't show you, it doesn't flash. It doesn't flash the column you're hovering over. It only shows you the column where you're starting. So if you want to pick a destination and find out where you want to move or insert your column, like I want to insert another new column between these two columns, so I can float over them and go say, yes, I want to insert a new column between B and C. So I'll figure that out before I start the operation. So now I'm going to drag this over between B and C, drop that there, and now I have a new column between B and C. And when I do an update through the column power tool, it will update the list of columns and expand this table according to the columns and the column order. Now, if you are working with a box component where you have what amounts to be a row within a row, you generally want to make sure you're selecting the row tools for the inner row, the row of boxes, as opposed to this outer row. So the box row is contained in a standard row. If you accidentally open the wrong column tool, you'll see that even though this is a set of 3 boxes, it's in a row that's only got one column, which is the entire set of boxes. So if you open the power tool and you have fewer columns than you're expecting, you probably hit the wrong control box and you ended up opening the column tool for the whole row instead of for the set of boxes. One thing to keep in mind is you want to close the column power tool if it's open before you do a save progress or publish your page. Otherwise, the HTML code for displaying the column power tool will actually get saved with your page. If you do that, it's not a disaster. If you haven't left the page yet, you can just close the tool and do your save progress or publish over again, and everything will be fine. If the power tool was off screen or something and you didn't realize that you saved it and you come back and reload the page, what you'll end up with is you'll have the power tool will be displayed, but it will be non-functional. The close button won't work. It won't drag. When you try to drag, it'll just select the text. All you have to do is go to a row in the same section. Each section is basically essentially a separate window in the page builder. So just go to any row that's in the same section, open the column tool again. Opening the column tool again will give you a new functional column power tool, but it'll also remove the dead one that got stored with the page but didn't have any controls associated with it. So once you do that, once you create the new power tool, it will function. You can close that. So the new one and the old one will be gone, and then you can save your progress or update normally. Now the column power tool does updates when you make changes within the column power tool, but if you go and you make changes, like if you rearrange a column or delete a column or change the column widths through the native Kartra controls, the column power tool does not monitor what you're doing outside of the column power tool. So if you do make a change outside, just close the power tool, open it again, and it will rescan the columns, and it'll be back up to date with the sizes and column orders. So now I'm going to talk about the sizing, how the columns and layout actually work. Kartra column layout is based on something called the Bootstrap column grid layout using version 3. And the way it's set up is each one of these, I'll call them display columns, how the columns display, it has an associated width and possibly a left offset. And these are specified in terms of the underlying grid columns. So the grid columns basically take the active content section of the page, not including the left and right margins, but the part that's used for actual content. The Bootstrap grid layout system divides that into 12 grid columns, equally sized, 8.33% width of this total overall space. So the width is how many grid columns wide your display column is going to be, and then the offset is how much blank space to the left of the display column, also in grid columns. So for example, if you have a 100% wide display column, if I had one column here covering the entire width, so a 100% display column, that would be set to 12 out of 12 grid columns. This column is a 66% width column that's centered. So that uses 8 out of the 12 grid columns, so 8 twelves is 2/3 or 66%. That leaves 4 grid columns, so we're using 8 out of the 12, leaving 4 grid columns. And because it's centered, we want to have half of the grid columns, the remaining grid columns, be to the left and half to the right. So we're going to have 8 grid columns making up our 2/3 width column or 66% width column. And then we're going to have 2 grid columns on the left and 2 grid columns on the right. And if we open that grid column, we see we've got a width of 8 grid columns and an offset of 2 grid columns. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the responsive part, when I say Bootstrap creates a responsive column grid layout, responsive just means that the layout of the columns can change for different screen sizes. And if you've been working with Kartra for any length of time at all, you've probably noticed that when you go to a smaller device, now our side-by-side columns are all stacked one on top of each other, regardless of how wide the column needed to be. They all pop to be 100% of the width of the usable space. And the way Bootstrap works, for Bootstrap 3, it differs in other versions, but in Bootstrap 3, there are 4 categories of screen sizes. The first is extra small, which roughly corresponds to smartphone screen sizes, and that is considered to be from 1 to 767 pixels wide. The next size up is small, which roughly corresponds to tablet screen sizes, and that's from 768 to 991 pixels. The next size up is medium, which would be either like a small full screen display or possibly a window within a display, and that's considered to be 992 to 1199 pixels wide. And then large is 1200 pixels and up. So the widths and offsets for specifying the number of grid columns apply to a particular device size, and then all devices that are larger than that device unless it's specifically overridden. So for example, in this 66% width centered column, that's 8 grid columns wide with a left offset of 2 grid columns. This setting applies to both the medium and the large size settings because it always applies to larger devices unless you have a different setting that overrides it. Now, when you use the Kartra column width tool, this tool only controls the medium size screen. There's no support in the native Kartra column sizing to handle these other sizes. So it sets values in this medium sized column, which of course are also inherited for larger size screens, but you can't specify a different setting for the larger monitors. You only get to specify this, and smaller devices will default to 12 out of 12 grid columns, or in other words 100% wide. And so that's why when we went to a tablet width or a phone type width, the columns, each column from our original display now takes up 100% of the width because there's no support in the Kartra UI for adjusting those settings. So what the column power tool does is through these entry fields we can create settings to override for other sizes. Let's take a look at the one for this row instead because it's a little more interesting. So now we've got our column tool. This one has the 4 separate rows and hence 4 separate columns. So here again are the size settings for our columns. You can see that we've got 3 grid columns for each of these for a total of 12 grid columns. So from left side to right side, 12 grid columns, 4 columns of 3 grid columns each, making them all equal size. So if I want to change that up a little bit, let me put something into those, and those are going to be a little bit smaller when I'm done. So let's take this, and I'll put a button in there. It's a little hard to get over there, so I'm going to just move that column there and put this column here, and I'll drag a button over here. So these are fairly small contents for those columns. So what I can do is I can say make that a smaller column. Oh, and by the way, to make a change to a column, just type in the new value, and then either when you tab out of that field or click out, it will make the change. So as I click from there into the next one, it's going to apply that change. I'm going to change this to be, because these are wider columns, I'm going to change that to be 4 grid columns, 2 grid columns, 4 grid columns, and so now I have that effect. So at this point we're only changing the medium size, the same size that the Kartra column adjuster will handle. And if we go to a different device, we see that they are still stacked one on top of each other. So even though this is a very narrow column, it still defaults to being 12 grid columns wide, or 100% of our screen. So we can gracefully degrade to smaller and smaller sizes. So we could say, instead of going to one column and stacking these four on top of each other, for a tablet, which is an intermediate sized device, we can actually do multiples of 12 grid columns to expand this into multiple display rows. So this one row I can display as multiple rows when I go to a smaller device, and I can do that by saying 2 columns for column A, and then 10 columns for column B. So that together, of course, 2 plus 10 is 12. So that will fill one row's worth of grid columns. And then I'm just going to repeat that for this. So now at this size, so our window is actually 1275 pixels right now. So we're actually operating within this range, but because nothing is specified here, we're just inheriting it from the medium size. So as we go to the tablet view, now you'll see we have 2 columns and 2 columns. So there's column A, column B, column C, column D. So instead of immediately degrading to everything stacked in one column, now we can control the layout a little more gracefully. And since we have no settings here, it's going to default to 12 grid columns. We could even duplicate or even just specify. We wouldn't really need to duplicate, because if we had these settings over here, we wouldn't need them here, because these settings would apply to every larger device until reset. But now when we look at this, if we go one smaller, we'll end up in this range. And now we've degraded to having everything stacked in one column. And here's our column power tool. And by the way, if you have it too far to the right, you can just go to your column tools, click on it, and it'll recenter at the upper left corner of the column. I believe I've covered all of my points, so that concludes this demonstration. I hope you found that helpful. Thank you for watching.